So 4.3 is going to cover completing the square. And so what we mean by completing the square is a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so you can solve quadratic equations by finding the square roots if one side of the equation is a perfect square trinomial. What a perfect square trinomial is your first and your last term are both perfect squares. Okay, if I only had a plus b squared, that would mean that I'm taking a plus b and multiplying it by itself because it's squared, and that's what squaring something means. If I were to FOIL this out, a times a would give me a squared, a times b would give me ab, b times a written in alphabetical order would also be ab, and then b times b would be your b squared. When I add ab plus ab, that is going to give me 2ab. So that is where the a squared plus 2ab plus b squared formula comes from. Okay? Now, our goal today is to figure out what that b squared term is, what that last term is, to complete that perfect square trinomial in order to get it into factored form. Because you can go back and forth. Okay? I could start with this, and if I knew my formula, I could factor it. I could start here, and I could factor it. I mean, I could FOIL it out. So our goal is to first recognize what is a perfect square trinomial, and then we're going to complete the trinomial, then get it into factored form. Okay? So if I were to cover this up, all right, x squared plus 8x plus 16. If I have the trinomial, the way I'm going to get it into factored form, if I take the square root of 16, that gives me 4. Alright, now recognize that my formula had a 2ab, so that means I would double the product of my a and my b. So if I had 4 and I doubled it, would it give me 8? Yes, so this is a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so what it would factor into is you're going to have your x, and then whatever sign is of my middle term, that's going to be the sign in my parentheses for factored form. And then when I took the square root of that last term, that is what goes in my factored form in parentheses squared. Okay? So same thing happens with x squared minus 14x plus 49. If I take the square root of 49, that gives me 7. If I double it, will it give me 14? Yes. Yes. So when I do my factored form, I've got x. Notice that that 14 is a negative, so I have a minus in parentheses, and then I have my 7 squared. Okay? So every time we're taking the square root, and then we're doubling it in order to verify that it's a perfect square trinomial. So when I look here, is x squared plus 10x plus 25 a perfect square trinomial? We're going to test that theory. So if I take the square root of 25, that gives me 5. If I double it, will it give me 10?
Yes.
Yes, this is a perfect square trinomial. So if I were to put that into factored form, I know I would have an x. My middle term is a plus. And what would my number be? 5. X plus 5 squared. Okay? So are y'all good going from the trinomial to the factored form?
Yeah.
Okay. So our goal from this point forward is finding this constant. So remember that your quadratics in standard form are ax squared plus bx plus c. So really what we're finding is that c. Okay? So if every time going backwards I'm taking the square root and then I'm doubling it, we're going to do the opposite of that. What's the opposite of doubling?
Halving.
You divide it by 2, and then the opposite of square root is square. So we're going to do those 2 steps to find our c. Okay? So if I have x squared plus 14x, I need to know what this plus c is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 14. It's always your middle term. Okay? Which is technically, if I do x squared plus bx plus c, it's your b. So I take 14 and divide it by 2, and that gives me 7. Okay, so then I take 7 and I square it, and that gives me
49.
49. This 49 is my c. All right, so my first step is I take my b, divide it by 2, and square that number. My second step is I complete my trinomial. So it's x squared plus 14x, and it's always going to be a plus right there. And then I have my 49. The reason it's always going to be plus your c is because you just squared a number. Whether it's positive or negative, it's always going to end up positive when you square it, because negative times negative will still give you a positive. So this should always be a plus. Okay? Then, once you get it into your trinomial, you get your parentheses squared. And then the 7 you got when you have b is what goes in parentheses. So if you think about it, when you're doing your first step, the number you get second is what you use first, and the number you get first is what you get second. Okay? Y'all follow those steps? Okay. Alright, if I look at x squared minus 6x plus c, my first step is I'm going to take that b, which is negative 6, carry down that negative with it, and divide it by 2, and that gives me negative 3. I'm going to take negative 3 in parentheses and square it. You have to pay attention to it being in parentheses if you type it in your calculator. Or if you always know when you square something it's going to be positive, then you should just know that's going to give me a positive 9. Okay, so then I'm going to complete the trinomial, and that gives me x squared minus 6x plus 9. And then factored form, I've got my parentheses squared, and it's going to be x minus 3. So x minus 3 squared is factored form for that trinomial. You're good with that? Yeah. Okay. Now what about if I have x squared minus 9x plus c? When I take an odd number and divide it by 2, it's going to say a fraction. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to take negative 9 halves and I'm going to square it. You can either type that in your calculator, or when you square a fraction, all you're doing is taking the numerator, squaring it, taking the denominator, squaring it. So negative 9 squared is 81, and 2 squared is 4. So my trinomial is x squared minus 9x plus 81 over 4. And then my factored form, I set up my parentheses squared. It's going to be x minus my 9 halves squared. Pay attention to that negative. It's got to be in factored form also. Are we good with that? Okay. So that's how we are going to complete the square. So now we need to figure out how are we going to solve using that method. Okay? Well, when we were factoring before y'all left for Thanksgiving break, we wanted everything equal to 0. Now it's not necessarily that case. We don't want it equal to 0. Okay? So what we're going to look for, our first step that we're going to look for is there a coefficient in front of x squared? Do I have an a? If I have an a, I'm going to divide everything by that a because I don't need that to complete the square. So once you divide that, you're going to have x squared plus bx plus c, okay, plus a constant. This constant is going to prevent this being a perfect square trinomial. So you're going to move that constant over to the other side. That's going to leave you with your x squared and your bx term, which at that point, you complete it just like we did on the first 3 examples. You take your b, divide it by 2, take that number, square it. We know we add that number, so if I just had x squared plus bx, we know we add it at the end, right? Well, with an equation, remember you have to keep it balanced. What you do to the left, you have to do to the right. So you're now going to add it in both spots. Alright? Then, what you're going to do is if I focus on my left, that will then be a perfect square trinomial. I can get it into factored form. Okay? My right, two constants, all I do is add them together. Okay, I combine like terms and it should look something like this. So, say I had x plus 3 squared equals 4. It should look something like this. Well, from this point forward, it's what we did before Thanksgiving. How would I solve this? You would take the square root of both sides. You got to undo that being squared. So you take the square root, and that would leave me with x plus 3 equals, remember when you take the square root, you have to have plus or minus 2. And then you would solve from there. Okay?
Right.
So your goal, make sure x squared is by itself with no coefficient. You're going to move the constant over because it's preventing it from being a perfect square trinomial. You're going to complete the square on the left and combine like terms on the right. Get it to factored form on the left. Then you start solving using square roots. Okay? So, if I have x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0. Alright, do I have a coefficient in front of x squared?
No.
No, so all I need to focus on is moving that constant of 15 over to the right. It's a plus 15, so I need to subtract 15. So x squared minus 8x equals negative 15. If I were to cover up the equals in that negative 15, this is what we just did. I'm going to take that negative 8 and divide it by 2, and that gives me negative 4. Take negative 4 and square it, and that's going to give me a positive 16. So what I'm going to do with the 16, I know I add it behind that 8x. Now I'm going to add it behind that negative 15. So I'm going to have x squared minus 8x plus 16 equals negative 15 plus 16. Okay? On the left, I have a perfect square trinomial. So I'm going to get the left side in factored form. So I'm going to have my parentheses squared, I'm going to have my x, and then the negative 4 that I got in my first step when I divided b by 2 is what I'm going to put there. Equals negative 15 plus 16 I combined to give me 1. Y'all follow me?
Yes.
Okay. Now I'm at the point where I can take the square root of both sides. And that leaves me with x minus 4 equals plus or minus, what's the square root of 1?
No.
1. You better have that plus or minus. Alright, then I need x by itself, so what do?
Minus 4. I have 4.
I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So x is equal to 4 plus or minus 1. Is that my answer? No, remember that I have two whole numbers. I need to split it. So I'm going to split it into x equals 4 plus 1 and x equals 4 minus 1 and simplify. So my two x values will be 5 and 3. Are y'all good with those steps? Okay. So if I have x squared plus 2x minus 3,
It's going to be x squared plus 2x equals 2.
I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So x squared plus 2x equals 3. Then I can take that 2 and divide it by 2, which is 1. Take 1 and square it.
It's 1.
So then when I add that to both sides, I have x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 3 plus 1. Remember that you add it to both sides.
Yes.
Okay, factored form on the left is going to be my x plus 1 squared equals 4. Alright, take the square root. X plus 1 equals plus or minus 2. I'm going to subtract my 1. Okay, but because it was a perfect square, I've got whole numbers that I can combine, so I'm going to have x equals negative 1 plus 2, and x equals negative 1 minus 2. So my x values are
1
and
negative
negative 3. Okay, now you are getting specific x values, so you could check your answers. Okay, how could I check my answers? I take my value, store it for x, and I type my original, make sure it's equal to whatever my original problem is equal to. Okay? Alright, so x squared plus 7x minus 30 equals 0.
X squared plus 7x equals 30.
Okay, you move that negative 30 by adding it, so x squared plus 7x equals 30. Take your 7, divide it by 2. That's going to say a fraction, because I have an odd number for b. So I'm going to square that. 7 squared is 49. 2 squared is 4. Remember that we work in improper fractions, not mixed numbers like your calculator would give you. So be careful with that. Alright, so I've got x squared plus 7x plus 49 over 4 equals 30 plus 49 over 4. My factored form on the left,
X plus 7 half
squared, equals
30 plus 49 over
42.
remember, it's improper fraction.
169 over 4.
So your calculator, y'all are, you can add that in your calculator, or you could do the common denominators in your head. But in your calculator, you could type 30 plus 49 over 4. Gives you a mixed number, but remember we don't do that. So second, and then that button gives you your 169 over 4.
So all that.
So x plus 7 halves is equal to plus or minus. Now remember when you take the square root of a fraction, you're really taking the square root of the numerator over the square root of the denominator. Okay, so the square root of 169 is 13, square root of 4 is 2. I'm going to move that 7 halves by subtracting 7 halves.
So negative 7 halves plus or minus 13 halves.
Okay, so I can split those. Negative 7 halves plus 13 halves. And x equals negative 7 halves minus 13 halves. So they're common denominators, so I just have to add the numerators. What's negative 7 plus 13? 6 divided by 2 is 3. Then negative 7 minus 13 is negative 20. Divided by 2 is negative 10. But again, you could type that in your calculator. Okay? We're good with that? Do y'all understand the steps?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to let you work on this next example, and then we're going to check it.
I've got 5 minutes.
Y'all ready?
Um,
Okay. I move my 10 over. X squared minus 4x equals,
-10.
you take your negative 4 divided by 2,
It's -2.
and then that squared.
4
So I've got x squared minus 4x
plus 4
equals negative 10.
plus 4.
Factored form on the left
X squared minus, x minus 2 squared,
equals,
-6.
alright, when you take the square root, I've got x minus 2 equals plus or minus
3i.
I squared is 6.
I squared of 6. Square root of 6 does not simplify because 6 is 2 and 3.
So x equals 2 plus or minus I squared root of 6.
Move your 2. X equals 2 plus or minus I square root of 6.
So there's an I.
Okay, I've got a radical and I've got an imaginary part. So I leave it like that. Okay, after lunch we're going to continue. Okay, since y'all are good with the steps, we're going to skip this one. We're going to move on to 2x squared minus 8x equals 20. Okay, so here, 2x squared minus 8x equals 20. I've got a coefficient in front of x squared that I want to get rid of. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to divide all three terms by that coefficient. So whatever that ax squared is, you're going to divide by a. Alright, so that's going to give me x squared minus 4x equals 10. Now you're back to everything we just did. Okay, so the only difference between this problem and the problems we've been doing is that you divide first. Alright, it's already equal to my constant. I don't have to move it back and then move it over again. It's already set up the way that I need it to be, so I just take negative 4, divide it by 2, and I get negative 2. Take negative 2, square it, and I get 4. Okay, so then I have x squared minus 4x plus 4 equals 10 plus 4. Alright, I've got the perfect square trinomial on the left, so I'm going to get it into factored form, which is going to be x minus 2 squared equals 14. Alright, so then we're going to take the square root of both sides, and I have x minus 2 is equal to plus or minus. Now the square root of 14, if I try to do the prime factor tree for 14, it just gives me 2 and 7. I cannot pair anything, so it stays the square root of 14. Okay, and then we're going to move that negative 2. We got to add 2, so that's going to give me x equals a positive 2.
Minus or plus square root of 14.
Mm-hmm. Are good with that? Okay. So 3x squared minus 15x equals 30.
First thing you do is divide by 3.
Get rid of the coefficient by dividing. So I've got x squared minus 5x equals 10.
Negative 5 divided by 2. Squared.
Gives me 25 over 4, because negative 5 squared is 25. 2 squared is 4.
And then
So I've got x squared minus 5x plus 25 over 4 equals 10 plus 25 over 4. Factored form is going to give me what?
x minus negative 5 over 2.
X minus 5½ squared
Mhm.
equals,
Um,
65 over 4. Take the square root. X minus 5½ is equal to plus or minus. Now remember that you're doing the square root of 65 over the square root of 4. Okay, so if I tried to break 65, that splits 5 and 13. I can't do anything with that, so it stays the square root of 65, but my denominator, square root of 4, becomes 2. Okay, so now I take that negative 5 halves and I add it.
X equals 5 halves plus or minus square root of 64 over 2.
Square root of 65 over 2.
65 over 2.
Okay, now, recognize that these are common denominators. Okay, so what we're going to do, when they have common denominators, we're going to write it as one fraction. It's going to be all over 2. So my numerator is 5 plus or minus the square root of 65. So I want you to write it all as 1 if they have common denominators.
Got it. So X equals
And even though this is 5 plus square root of 65 over 2, you can still check your answers. You type that, store it for X, and it will store the entire decimal. Okay? Alright. Now what we're going to do is we're going to find that, we're going to find the values of X for the given area. Okay? So I have a rectangle with a width of X and a length of X plus 6.
equals 42 in area.
So your formula for area is length times width. Okay. Now I'm going to flip that order. I'm going to do length times width on the left because my length and my width are my variables. I want my variables on the left. Okay. So my length and my width, I'm just multiplying. So I'm going to have X times X plus 6 equal to my area, which is 42. Okay? Now I need to look at how can I simplify X times X plus 6.
You carry the X.
You distribute. X times X is going to give me X squared. X times 6 is going to give me 6X. And that's going to equal 42. Okay, y'all good so far setting it up? Alright, now, could you subtract the 42, get it equal to 0, and factor it and get your X values? Yes, but not in this particular lesson. Okay, your instructions say completing the square. So I expect you to solve it by completing the square. Okay, so here, I've already got it equal to my constant, so I just take 6, divide it by 2, and that gives me 3. Take 3 and square it, and that gives me 9. So X squared plus 6X plus 9 is equal to 42
Plus 9.
plus 9. So my factored form becomes X plus 3 squared equals 42 plus 9 is 51.
Square root that.
Take the square root of both sides. X plus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 51. Take that 3. You're going to have to move it to the other side by subtracting 3. So X is equal to negative 3 plus or minus square root of 51. Okay? Do we have any questions? All right. So now I've got the area of a triangle. So the area of a triangle is 1/2 base times height. Okay, so I've got 1/2. What's my base?
X plus 8.
And my height is X. Equals my area, which is 30. Okay, from this point you could do two things. You could multiply and distribute your 1/2 and your X and this whole thing. But remember that your goal is to have X squared by itself. So distributing that 1/2 really is not going to do any good for you. Okay? So what I would do is get rid of that 1/2 by multiplying by the reciprocal. Okay, so I'm going to take the entire equation and I'm going to multiply it by 2/1, which is just 2. That's going to allow me to get rid of the fraction on the left side, and I'm going to rewrite x times x plus 8 equals 30 times 2 is 60. So x times x is going to give me x squared plus x times 8 is 8x equals 60.
Where did you get the 60 from?
30 times 2.
Okay.
You multiply the entire equation by that 2 to get rid of that fraction.
Okay, then why did we not change the x and the 8?
Because you've got all of this multiplied. So when you multiply by 2, you don't have to do 2 times 2 times 2 because it's all 1. If I had plus, if I was adding them all, then yes.
Okay.
Do you get what I'm saying now?
No.
Okay. So if I have okay, if I just have this, we know we distribute this way and you get your 2x plus 8.
Yeah.
Well, you do that because you have 2 terms being added. But if I just had 2 times 4 times x, all I would be doing is 2 times 4, which is my 8x. I'm not doing 2 times 4 and 2 times x.
Okay.
You get the difference there?
Yeah.
So when you're multiplying, you only really have to do, and it's kind of like a like term, you only distribute when you have them all added or subtracted together.
Got it.
Okay? Alright, so here I've got x squared plus 8x equals 60. So I'm going to take 8 divided by 2. That gives me 4. Take 4 and square it, which gives me 16. So I've got x squared plus 8x plus 16 equals 60 plus 16. So my factored form is going to give me x plus
4 squared equals 76.
Hmm?
Square it.
take the square root.
X plus 4.
Now 76 I can break. Okay, I can split that into 2 and 38. 38 will split 2 and 19. So I have a pair of 2's with a 19 left over.
So plus or minus 2 square root of 19. X would equal 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 19.
Alright, so that's a positive 4. I got to subtract it. So x is equal to negative 4
We'll write negative.
plus or minus 2 square root of 19. I'm good with that? Okay. Y'all are going to have a quiz over this next class. Okay?